There's no way that I could have made it from reading 1L as a freshman in college to Supreme Court religious liberty litigator getting ready to argue his 14th case unless I had trusted God with the career management plan the whole way. We were pretty certain that we were going to lose. We were only making a record for history. But I thought it was critically important that someone would be standing for the truth about marriage in front of the Supreme Court when that decision was being made. Under Title VII, a company has to give a religious accommodation if it's one that's not going to be an undue burden on the business. And what's an undue burden?
What does it take to defend truth at the highest court in the land? In this episode, we sit down with John Bursch, a Supreme Court advocate who's argued major cases on life, marriage, and religious freedom. Welcome to the 11 Talents Podcast.
So John Bursch, thanks for joining us on the 11 Talents Podcast, where we talk about the intersection of faith and business and really people that have talked the talk and walked the walk of being given much and then multiplied it in many ways. That's the whole point of the 11 Talents Podcast. And you are a member of our Grand Rapids chapter, and we were just chatting that you are on your third rendition of it, I guess, or second rendition of the chapter. You've been president 3 times over now. I want to start, though, with just the fact that you are an esteemed lawyer. I'm originally from Maryland. I grew up going to the March for Life every year. And in Maryland, you know, like as going to Catholic schools, like it was ingrained in our blood. You know, every January we write stories about our pro-life stories. And you were on the front lines of overturning Roe v. Wade after, 43 years, was it?
Yeah, 72. Yeah, about that.
Yeah. What was that like? I mean, it was a huge day in the moment of history for Catholics especially, but tell us, what was that like?
Well, it was amazing because many people, lawyers, politicians, and others in the movement didn't think that they would see Roe overturned in their lifetime. And we had started a strategy at the public interest firm where I am now, Alliance Defending Freedom, to try to start knocking out the underpinnings of Roe. And one of those was to pass a 15 weeks law. So it prohibited abortion after 15 weeks. And that was crucial because, as you know, as Roe was modified in Casey, viability was the line. And 15 weeks, everyone acknowledged, was before viability. So we got a couple of states. Mississippi was the first one to do that. And it kind of gave us this hope that maybe we could get something to the court. And so I had the honor of working with Mississippi to draft their cert petition, which is the formal request you make to the Supreme Court to take the case. But even as we were doing it, we weren't confident that anything was going to happen. And then just before the petition was going to be considered, Justice Ginsburg passed away. And that was unexpected.
Oh, yeah.
And so the court immediately put the Mississippi petition, Dobbs, on ice. And it just sat there as President Trump nominated Justice Barrett, and she got confirmed, and many months went by. And then finally the next spring, they said, yes, we'll hear the case. Well, I think at a moment only God could have inspired. At the last minute, when we were writing the petition, we asked the court to strike down the viability line so states could protect life sooner than 22 weeks. But if the court thought that Roe was just egregiously wrong, then it should be overruled. And with that 2-sentence invitation, we ended up pushing that forward on the merits. The Solicitor General of Mississippi, Scott Stewart, did an absolutely fabulous job at the oral argument. And the court overturned the precedent. And here we are, nearly half a century after that terrible decision. And the whole country was rejoicing. It was an unbelievable moment in the pro-life movement, but also for me personally to know that God had given me that role in it.
So what year then? I mean, we're in 2026 now. What year was this?
Yeah, it must have been 2022. So it was 49 and a half years from when Roe was decided until Dobbs was decided.
And by 2022, I mean, how many times had you appeared before the Supreme Court to argue cases? And also, maybe that's a stupid question, but tell me a little bit about, like, what does that mean? Because I think for a lot of us, you think Judge Judy or something, or you've been to court, hopefully on not so bad things, but you see one judge, but the Supreme Court obviously is 9 justices. And like, how does that look in terms of going before the Supreme Court to argue a case.
Yeah, it's a whole different ball of wax. And I've argued in front of even bigger courts. If you argue a case in front of the 11th Circuit, it's 11 judges. If you argue a case in front of the en banc 6th Circuit, it can be 16 judges. So those are even bigger. But there's nothing quite like the solemnity and the history of walking into that Supreme Court building where so many famous decisions have been handed down, where really famous cases have been argued. And so anytime you're there, it's a really special place. I think I may have argued 12 cases by the time Dobbs was happening. As I mentioned, Scott Stewart, the Mississippi Solicitor General, actually argued Dobbs. But since then, I argued a 13th case about defunding Planned Parenthood, which we won. And then I'll soon be arguing a 14th. But every time you walk in, there's just kind of like this momentous weight on your shoulders about the proceedings and that something important is taking place there.
Yeah, wow. As a lawyer, are you thinking, first and foremost, I'm hoping it's a Catholic? Or are you thinking, first and foremost, I'm hoping it's a conservative? Like, what goes through your mind as a lawyer in terms of kind of projecting or hoping or anticipating future justices?
I just want a justice that will fairly apply the law the way that it was intended at the time that it was adopted, which some would say is a conservative principle. I would just say is the only correct way to look at the law. You can't have a law enacted in 1960, for example, change its meaning over time because culture changes and that the law remains fixed. And that's all I want, is a judge who will fairly apply the law. If you look at the court and its composition from a religious perspective, someone like Justice Sotomayor was raised Catholic. She was a product of Catholic schools all the way through high school, and yet frequently would issue rulings in a way that I don't think is a faithful application of the law. I know she would disagree with that. So I was just thrilled to see someone like Justice Barrett. It was personally gratifying to know that she had a deep, abiding Catholic faith and that she cared very deeply about her family, that she had adopted children and had extended her family love outside the family to additional children that way. Like everything that I knew about her personally was absolutely terrific. But it was also important to me that she had a reputation as a law professor and as a Seventh Circuit judge, as someone who applied the law the way that it was originally intended. And so that gave us hope that we were going to be able to count to 5 in the Dobbs case. And it turned out that it was crucial she was there, because Chief Justice Roberts would have only done the more narrow, let's get rid of the viability line. He did not vote with the other 5 justices to wipe out Roe completely. So we needed Justice Barrett there. Did God preordain all that ahead of time? You look at it, you think, well, maybe he did, but certainly he allowed it to happen. And there's no question that we could not have made it across the finish line without Justice Barrett.
Yeah, God's always got a plan. We just have to let him do his work, right?
Yes.
And get out of the way. As administrations change, there's always the question and conversation of, we should add more. Because I think the Supreme Court started with, was it 5 justices originally? I did take a constitutional law class 20 years ago, but here I am trying to remember. What are your thoughts on adding more Supreme Court justices? Is this going to happen? Is it going to be good for it? I mean, obviously, you've got your maybe prejudice or bias as a Catholic, as a conservative, but where do you think we are on that?
Well, generally speaking, I'm pretty happy with the majority composition that we have now. They don't get it right 100% of the time, but they do a pretty good job. And so if you were packing the court with additional justices, I would be concerned that it would be flipped in some way, that the decisions would be diluted, quality would go down, whatever that might be. It's funny with the adding seats, it's only ever raised by the party that does not have a majority of justices.
Oh, yeah.
So right now you're hearing it from the progressives because they're not getting what they want in the decisions. And if it was the opposite way, maybe you would be hearing conservative politicians saying, we should add additional seats to the court. But for the long-term institutional stability and for the rule of law in the United States, you can't be doing that, no matter who's in charge and no matter what the justices look like, because as soon as one party adds more seats during their time in the White House, then the next party will do it when they're in control. And someday you'd have a Supreme Court with 247 justices on it. It would just be a complete mess. So I think we've got to stick with the 9 that we have and just do the best that we can in whatever court hand we're dealt.
Do you ever foresee it or hope that it gets reduced again? from
No,
9?
9 seems about right. Yeah, that's a good number at oral argument. It's enough diversity of viewpoints that you get a fair vetting of all the possible sides of a case when it's up there. I like the odd number. For a while, at different points in history, there was an even number of justices. For a while, it was 10 before they reduced it back down to 9. That seems silly because then you end up with ties. What good is that? So I'm
with
feeling
pretty big
good.
decisions, I
Right.
mean, it's
Well, what's unfortunate is that we're in a political climate where people are not talking to each other across the political divide, and Congress isn't really doing anything. I mean, here we have Republican House and Senate and White House, and they haven't passed any significant legislation since they got in there more than a year ago. And so as a result of that, people take more of the social disputes to the court, and they really shouldn't be resolved there. These big questions about abortion and marriage and things like that should be decided through the democratic process. And so it short circuits that dialogue between neighbors when you rush to the court to try to get issues decided there. And you could see that with Roe. I mean, even Justice Ginsburg, who strongly supported abortion, thought that Roe might have been a mistake because it cut off a dialogue that was happening between people about the meaning of life.
Yeah.
And it was only with Dobbs that we're able to, in a meaningful way, have a conversation about that issue again.
How important do you think that, I don't know if it was considered a leak or if it was just her getting older and being more transparent with how she felt about that? I mean, do you think that was pretty important to it eventually maybe changing some minds of people in terms of Roe being a mistake?
Well, it was certainly helpful to the folks who were trying to overturn Roe because we constantly went back to that over and over again, that it's a decision that lacked any real legal reasoning and that it cut off an important political debate, see Justice Ginsburg.
Yeah.
So it became a very important part for talking about the case.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why she said it. I'm sure it was just a moment of honesty and transparency on her part, but it really helped the pro-life movement in pushing that ball forward.
Yeah. So you are a lawyer representing Alliance Defending Freedom, which is a great organization that's global. Lawyers all over the world working to fight religious liberty cases. And but here in Michigan, Roe v. Wade gets passed, but then in Michigan, our lovely governor doubles down on abortion. So then the question becomes, was it all in vain? Does it even matter that we overturned Roe v. Wade?
Yes. Well, first, it's encouraging because we have now a half a dozen states that prohibit abortion beginning at conception. And that was something that didn't exist before. And that's important because of the lives saved, first and foremost. But even as you think about the pro-life movement and kind of its evolution, now we have examples where even in Michigan, we can point people and say, look, this state doesn't have abortion at all in Texas. And yet women are not dying in the back alley. If they choose to stay home and raise their kids, they can do that. If they choose to go to college and have professional careers, they can do that. We actually have an example to show what a flourishing pro-life state looks like. And that's helpful when you're talking to people about what should happen here. There's another half a dozen states that prohibit abortion up until 6 weeks, maybe not from conception, but at least till 6 weeks. So again, more babies saved, more examples of being able to point to women who had children and were still able to have fulfilling adult lives. That's all very valuable. So thinking about us here in Michigan, the important thing is to not get discouraged, to recognize that it was really on us as Catholics, as a church writ large, not to be talking more about abortion with our kids and our grandkids and in the public square and at our parishes and things like that. While Roe was on the books, Prop 3 was a consequence of us not being ahead of that issue. And so now we need to do the hard grassroots evangelization, convincing people that life is something that's worth protecting. And we're being successful at that. If you look at a group like Protect Life Michigan, they go into a community and spend a summer going door to door. They've got electronic and billboard messaging and lots of ways to try to persuade people. And even in a very purpley, maybe even kind of blue area like Plymouth Canton, they can move the numbers on people's support for pro-life issues by 8% just in a summer.
Wow.
And so we all need to be doing that, having those conversations, talking up why life is always inherently valuable, worthy of dignity and protection. And eventually we can move that needle to the point where we can have the same thing that Texas has. So there's a long game that's involved. And I mean, let's face it, we're all impatient, whether it's on social media or waiting in line at the grocery store, we want everything immediately. But for true cultural change, you really need to dig in and change hearts and minds. And we're in the process of doing that in Michigan, and other states that have already adopted a pro-life approach are a beacon of hope for us.
What do you tell, though? I mean, when you speak to Legatus chapters as an example, because you've spoken to quite a few of them, and at our summit, what's the message for business owners, for CEOs and presidents?
Well, the top line message is that as Catholics, it's our duty to carry our faith into the workplace. That's why we're part of Legatus. We're ambassadors. And so if you're not thinking about faith being part of your professional calling, then you're just not thinking about business the right way. You haven't completely imbibed what Legatus is trying to teach all of us, that you have to take it there. If you are a Catholic business owner, it's somewhat easier, although you still have to be courageous. Make sure that your bylaws and your articles say that you're going to run your business in accord with your Catholic faith. And then when you buy health insurance, make sure that it doesn't have abortion coverage, that it doesn't have contraception coverage, that it doesn't have coverage for these dangerous puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for gender transitions, because all of those things violate Christ's laws for human flourishing. So as business owners, we need to make sure that our own businesses are operating according to those principles. Now, if you're outside that environment, say you're a CEO at a public company, there's no law that prohibits you from talking about these issues. And so just do it in a winsome way. Look for opportunities to talk one-on-one with people. And maybe you even get to a point, in a publicly traded company, this would be tough, but maybe a privately held company where you're the CEO but not the owner, maybe you persuade upper management and the owner that there shouldn't be abortion in the company healthcare plan because it's wrong to take human life. But there's nothing wrong with having those conversations in the break room over dinner, and those don't start by walking into the CFO's office and saying, "Hey, have you ever thought about ditching abortion coverage in our health plan?" But it starts at the board meeting, that when lunch is served, you bow your head, make the sign of the cross, and you say a quiet prayer, and then someone asks you about that, or you invite the CFO to come to Mass with you, and they say, "Well, I've never been to a Catholic Mass. Well, I think you'd really like it. Why don't you come try this out?" And so on and so forth. And it's in building those relationships, living out your faith in your calling, that it then leads to conversations about the pro-life issues that we've been discussing, or other things that are of fundamental importance to human flourishing. And the frustrating thing is that people are afraid to talk about it when it's so vital. Like if you had an opportunity where all someone had to do was walk into an office and they could collect $100,000, no strings, no questions asked, you would tell everybody that you knew about it because you would want everyone to have that good experience. Well, we have that, only it's even better than $100,000. It's eternal life, it's happy marriages, it's beautiful families, all the things that the Catholic Church has to offer. Why wouldn't we want to share that joy and allow everyone to participate in it?
Living the fully integrated life.
Amen.
It's beautiful. So speaking of your integrated life, tell me a little bit about your family, because I don't think you or your wife come from a law family background in terms of your parents, right? Yeah,
this could be a really long podcast if I gave you the whole story. But when I was first in college, I was an engineering major. And then I was on a weekend trip to Chicago and picked up a book called 1L by Scott Turow. And he usually writes legal thrillers like John
Harvard. Was he at Harvard?
It was about his experience as a first-year law student at Harvard.
Okay.
And I thought, that's what I want to do. The Socratic method and the rigor of the thinking and all that. I want to go to law school. And I didn't know any lawyers. I didn't have any in the family. I didn't know what they did. I had no idea what I would do with a law degree. But I felt called to do that. And when I first graduated from law school, I had no sense whatsoever that I would be arguing cases at the Supreme Court, much less about all these issues that the church cares about, everything from the meaning of marriage to the abortion issue to defunding Planned Parenthood. Just had no sense that would be my career path. But what God did is he continually opened doors and would ask our family to say yes. And so Angela and I would sit down with the kids, we'd talk about it, we would pray, we would discern and look for what God wanted us to do. And in hindsight, people would look at my career choices and say, wow, those are really dumb in the way of the world.
Sure.
Because sometimes saying yes meant giving up prosperity. It meant giving up popularity. It meant giving up the security of a paycheck and all those things. But it was through that process that God was shaping us as a family and then ultimately preparing me for the role that I'm in now. There's no way that I could have made it from reading 1L as a freshman in college to Supreme Court religious liberty litigator getting ready to argue his 14th case unless I had trusted God with the career management plan the whole way.
So that book got you to think about the law side of things. I mean, you clearly have a great understanding of your Catholic faith and how to live an integrated life. Was there a moment in your life where it wasn't like that, or maybe it was a mentor that you had or your parents? What made that shift for you? Because clearly, I'd say you haven't figured out.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because when my wife and I met in college, I would say that we were good weekend Catholics. We went to Mass. We did confession once or twice a year. But if you had asked us how the bread and wine become Christ's body and blood, or why the church teaches what it does about contraception or any of those things, we would not have had a clue. So the turning point for us was actually having kids. Our children we have 5 now, ages 19 to 28. But when the first 2 or 3 were fairly little, as you know, they asked questions about everything. And they weren't asking questions about our Catholic faith yet, but we knew they were coming. And we decided we better get ready because we want to be able to answer those questions when they come. Yeah. Why do we go to church? Why do we believe that there's a God? Why do we believe in Jesus Christ? All these things. And so I signed up for an apologetics class that was offered at a Catholic bookstore in Grand Rapids. And I came home and I was showing the materials to Angela every week saying, you're not going to believe it. This is why we have celibate priests. This is why we go to confession instead of just asking God to forgive our sins. This is what transubstantiation is. And so that just started us on a path of lifelong learning as a married couple. And for me, I love the doctrine and I love Bible study. So I really dig deeply into that. Angela loves the spiritual side, prayer, the movement of the Holy Spirit. And so she really digs into that. And then we come back and put all the pieces together. And because we were learning about all these things, answering questions, and then also living our life in a way that showed that our faith was important to us. Again, making career decisions that showed that God was first and not worldly desires. Our kids picked up on all that. And so now we've got these 5 wonderful adult children, 3 married, 1 soon to be engaged, and they are all deeply in love with the Catholic Church and their faith.
That's beautiful.
Have been active in the pro-life movement, evangelize, even from young ages. And now we've got 3 grandchildren and 1 on the way. And they too are being imbibed in the importance of living out this life following Christ.
You can't be a grandfather, John.
Admittedly,
I'm young,
true.
But you look very young as well.
Thank you.
And you've got grandkids. That's amazing.
Yeah, beautiful Catholic grandkids.
That's beautiful. The word that you keep using, or that keeps coming to my mind in business and at home, is modeling. Modeling the behavior. Like, you never know who's watching, whether it's your kids, whether it's employees, whether it's other lawyers or professionals in your life. And I just love that you do that. You walk the walk.
Well, employees will know when you're saying one thing and doing something else, and kids will know it in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
They're the most attentive and wise stewards of the truth. And if they see that anyone is acting in a hypocritical manner, something that contradicts what they've been saying, they'll catch you immediately. And so that's very, very important. And I can remember being specifically at a Legatus regional meeting, all the chapters in Michigan. There may have been a couple from Ohio. We were at the Inn at St. John's in Plymouth. And the president of Steubenville, Father
Dave Pavanka.
Thank you. Father Pavanka was speaking. And the topic was, how do you keep your kids Catholic?
Yes.
And he gave us a couple of different examples, but one of the highlights was that you show them that your faith is more to you than just going to Mass on Sundays, that everything that you do in your life is driven by your faith. And then explain to your kids why that's so. And that was something that we took really to heart when he said that, and I've tried to model that.
Yeah, he also gave a story during that talk that I will always remember, because Tom Monahan was in that talk, and he started out the conversation. I don't know if you remember this with, Tom, when you were on the board, your helicopter used to land on the property at Steubenville, and wherever it landed, when you left, a new building popped up. thanks to your funding. And so if you ever want to fly back into Steubenville, we'll be welcoming to have you. But when we talk about going back to Roe v. Wade and the pro-life, you always hear about a case that comes up that is kind of on the forefront, and that's the Obergefell case. Can you tell us a little bit about that case and why that is so meaningful, whether it be to the Roe v. Wade conversation or just to Catholics, period? Well,
I argued Obergefell, and so I have some personal PTSD.
I may have known that
a
little bit, but that's huge, though. I mean, that's. Did you ever think that you were going to be doing things like this?
Not in a million years.
Yeah.
Again, that's all God. And the thing about that one is that when we went in, we were pretty certain that we were going to lose. We were only making a record for history. But I thought it was critically important that someone would be standing for the truth about marriage in front of the Supreme Court when that decision was being made. And to this day, if you look at the opinion that Justice Kennedy authored, almost no law professor or lawyer will defend it because it doesn't really contain any legal reasoning. It's basically a philosopher's rant about how marriage is not something that can be limited to a man and woman, that any people who love each other should be able to partake in that, and that if the government doesn't bestow that marriage title on them, it's taking their dignity away from them. And we could have another whole podcast just about how all of those things are wrong. Yeah. So what do we do about that going forward? Well, as long as there's as much political support for same-sex marriage as there is right now, it's unrealistic to think that the Supreme Court will be overturning Obergefell anytime soon. There was a cert petition by that Kim Davis not long ago. Everybody was talking about it. Could be this be the case to overturn Obergefell? It didn't get even one recorded vote for a grant because the court can't act when the culture is like that. That's why we needed a 49.5-year pro-life movement to plant the seeds, to hold the soil for Dobbs, and we need to do the same thing for marriage. So as Catholics, how we should be thinking about this is figuring out why the church teaches what it does about marriage, and that means you absolutely need to be able to explain to your kids and grandkids St. JP2's theology of the body. That's where it all starts. If you get that and the complementariness and how marriage is an icon of the Trinity, where a husband and a wife come together in a sacramental marriage, and their love is so strong, their union so complete, that proceeding from it is a third person that needs its own name, a son or a daughter. In the same way that the eternal exchange of love between God the Father and God the Son, proceeding from that love is the Holy Spirit. That's like the whole cornerstone of our understanding of the Trinity. And if you get that wrong, then you're going to get everything else wrong too.
Yeah.
But then, talk to our kids about it. And I say that because they need to understand why the Catholic Church teaches what it does, so that they too will then live out that calling and that definition of marriage as they get older. But also, if you lose your kids on issues like same-sex marriage, gender ideology, abortion, and things like that, chances are they're going to walk away from the faith too. There's almost a direct correlation between the number of people who are progressive on the same-sex issue and those who will describe themselves as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, as having no affiliation with any religion. We tend to think about the sexual issues as something that we shouldn't talk about in public because they're private and lots of people disagree with us, and we don't want people to think that we're hateful, even though the teachings themselves are loving. And what we don't understand is that these are a fundamental part of what it means to be human. And you go all the way back to New Testament times, the idea that you couldn't get divorce, that marriage was permanent, that was as shocking to the disciples as it was to turn the other cheek if you were struck by someone. The whole notion of having a one man, one woman dedicated marriage that could never be severed, you'd always be faithful to your wife, complete revolution at the time that the apostles were starting to grow the early Catholic Church. And so it's no surprise that it would be an important part of our DNA today too. So we can't ignore a decision like Obergefell, just like we couldn't ignore Roe, but it's going to take years and years of hard work in the trenches and catechesis before the court is ready to accept an overturn of that decision.
You arguing that case, is that what led you to write the book you recently wrote on the gender topic and share the title with us too?
Yeah, Sophia Institute Press published the book. It's called Loving God's Children, The Church and Gender Ideology. Yeah. And Obergefell may have been the start because even though I had argued other cases that were cultural hot points. Nothing like Obergefell. That was completely another realm. So to litigate Obergefell, not only did I need to understand the law, but I felt it was necessary to go back and study the Catholic Church's teachings on marriage. And that's what led me to theology of the body and some other things. And then post Obergefell, I'm sure you and everybody watching this saw what happened next. Immediately, the progressive activist movement tried to add the T to the LGB train. It was no coincidence that Bruce Jenner came out as Caitlyn Jenner the same summer that Obergefell was decided. It's no coincidence that I Am Jazz, the story on cable about the boy who became a girl, came out right after Obergefell was decided. Like they were ready for that moment because they knew what Justice Kennedy was going to do. So as I was starting to do work for Alliance Defending Freedom, quickly discovered that the new religious liberty and free speech and parental rights fight was in the gender ideology area. If you used pronouns at work, you would be fired. If you didn't allow your kid to transition, then you could have them taken away for child neglect. If you wanted to adopt or be a foster parent and you wouldn't agree up front to allow the kids to transition if they declared they were transgender, then you were immediately cut off. You couldn't participate in the program. Catholic churches and others being sued because they didn't have transgender care coverage. It just goes on and on and on. So, through all this, I wanted to do the same thing. What does the church say about this? And I was shocked and delighted to find out that popes and encyclicals and other documents and U.S. bishops and beautiful exhortations had explained all kinds of things about the human body and why our sexuality is a gift from God, how we are embodied souls, that we are not a separate mind and body where you can just manipulate your body to be whatever you want it to be. And so all that kind of came together in the book. And I really wanted it to be something that you could hand to any lay Catholic who did not have a law degree, did not have a theology degree, did not have a medical degree, to understand the church's teachings, why this was best for human flourishing, and why the science is entirely on our side with respect to everything the church has ever said about human anthropology and gender ideology.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, what a lot of us need are just in plain words. How do we explain it? Because we don't, not all of us are, as you said, lawyers or physicians, doctors that know all the science behind it. So thank you for writing that and making it available.
Thank you
to all of us. And you've argued a lot of cases around gender. We're seeing a lot more in society with especially men in women's locker rooms and trying to be on, playing female sports. What kind of cases are you arguing there, and where do you see it? Where do you see the trajectory here? Are we nearing the end, or are we still sorting this out as a society?
We're about halfway, I think. On January 13th, so not very long ago, we had two cases at the Supreme Court where I was co-counsel with Idaho and West Virginia. And they were two of 27 states that passed the ADF Model Save Women's Sports Bill that says sports teams are assigned based on sex, male teams and female teams. And just because you're a male who identifies as a woman or a girl, that doesn't mean that you get to play on the female team. And those were struck down in those two states, West Virginia and Idaho, by federal courts of appeal. And the U.S. Supreme Court took those cases. One said that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to have only girls' teams. The other one said it violated Title IX, which is the law that was enacted 50 years ago, specifically to give women and girls their own sports space where they wouldn't have to compete against boys. And from a practical, competitive perspective, they're extremely important cases because we all know that on average, boys are bigger, stronger, faster, more agile. I mean, that's why we have an NBA and a WNBA, why we have a men's PGA
it's
Tour.
It's just the truth, right? I mean,
it's just the biological truth.
Is. Yeah.
And you can't deny that. And there have been some arguments that if you suppress your testosterone, that perhaps that would make it more competitive. Well, that Leah Thomas, that was the male who won the women's NCAA gold medal over two women Olympians.
Swimming, right?
500 meters, had been on testosterone suppression for at least a year. It might have been 2 years. And and his performance had decreased about 5.5%. And you might say, oh, well, that makes it fair. Well, the difference between men and women in that event at that level is 9%. So even though he was less
4%?
competitive,
Yeah.
he went from 65th in the men's division to first in the women's division. And so that's not right.
Right.
And even if you go all the way back to pre-puberty, some will say, well, if you've got a boy who was on puberty blockers, never went through male puberty, so on and so forth, they should be able to compete. Well, people don't know that pre-puberty boys have, for example, a 13% advantage in the javelin throw, because even before puberty, there are differences in bone structure and muscle distribution and so on and so forth. So just from that perspective, it's important. But it's doubly important because we need to talk about the truth. And if we're not talking about the biological differences between male and female and how that can't be changed, it doesn't matter what you profess, then we can't get people to consider the important truths about the gender ideology movement as a whole. So the sports issue is really a bridge to having a conversation about these important things. So the reason I say we're only halfway there is the Supreme Court will issue a ruling, most likely in June, probably upholding those states' sports laws. But that still leaves all the blue states, which have the same laws, or which have the opposite laws, and say that boys can compete on the girls' teams if they identify that way. And so we're already litigating in a case involving softball players in Minnesota, where a male player last year pitched every single inning of the playoffs and won the state championship on a girls' team. We're making the argument that Title IX not only allows states to have male and female separate teams, but it requires them to. And so we'll see where that ends. That'll probably be a few more years yet.
When it comes to the business world, though, I mean, where do you fall on how involved? I mean, obviously, Legata is dealing with CEOs and presidents, managing partners, people that are at the top of their companies, and you're constantly getting these woke ideologies brought into it in all different ways, whether it's the makeup of the board and making sure that you've got the diversity that you're supposed to have to, the insurance, requirements that, you provide for employees. What's your education or recommendation to CEOs and presidents to prepare them better to understand what they can legally do and how they're not going to fall into this pit of legalese or constantly be paying lawyers to climb out of?
Well, there's more legal protection there for your religious beliefs in the workplace than maybe you think. Obviously, as a boss, you can't be proselytizing at work, although you can certainly have private conversations when someone initiates that. So, always be prepared to say why you believe in Jesus Christ if someone asks you that question. But just thinking about like the woke people sitting on top of you and the kinds of accommodations you can request. Under Title VII, a company has to give a religious accommodation if it's one that's not going to be an undue burden on the business. And what's an undue burden? I'm not sure that anybody can define exactly, and it's certainly being worked out in the courts in the context of some of these things. But say, for example, that you were a CEO and you had a really woke board and a really woke HR department, and you were told that you needed to put preferred pronouns on your signature block.
Yeah.
And you said, well, I'm not going to do that because I think that preferred pronouns are a lie, and that I need to use sex-reflective pronouns because that's truthful and it's what's best for human flourishing. And they say, well, we really want you to do this. Well, then ask for a religious accommodation. It would be no undue hardship to the company if your signature block did not have he/him or she/her. That's the kind of simple way that you can kind of push back on that a little bit. And if they ask further questions about that, then again, you need to be prepared to explain yourself, read the book. And then you can say, well, I think it's because those who continue to live out a transgender life and take the drugs and the surgery and things like that have no better mental health outcomes and suffer from all these other medical ailments and things like that. In good conscience, I could never recommend to anyone that they go down that path because it just leads to hardship and lifetime as a medical patient. And so you can do that in a lot of different ways. Other things like maybe convening a Bible study on Wednesday mornings before work starts. The workplace can't have an objection to that. If they don't want you to do it in the workplace, then do it at the coffee shop, just up the road. So there are many things that you can do without getting in violation of the law. And if you're having concerns about that, like, what can I do? What can't I do? There are great guides out there. The Alliance Defending Freedom, where I work, has a guide for business people about faith in the workplace. Napa Legal is doing absolutely stellar work in that same area. So get educated about what you can do and can't do, and then just speak the truth. Ultimately, everybody at the office should know that you are a super nice person and that you are Catholic.
Yeah.
And everything else can just flow from that.
So is it a prerequisite to be a lawyer that you have to wear a bow tie all the time?
There's not many people who wear bow ties. I see more bow ties on CPAs and maybe a few engineers. Some lawyers will do it.
Yeah.
For me, the first one was a gift from Angela.
Okay.
And so I wore it to a very unimportant hearing in a Michigan state court when I was a very young lawyer. And he ruled from the bench in our favor. But after the hearing was over, he said, "Mr. Bursch, I want to see you in my chambers." And as a young lawyer, that's a bad thing. That means you did something that he didn't like. And so we went back to his office. He said, "Sit down." And so I did. And he opened up his desk drawers and he started pulling out dozens of bow tie catalogs. And he wanted to tell me where I could buy them, what I would look good in, to just encourage me. And I thought, wow, if that's going to get the judge's attention like that, maybe I should try this more often. And so I continued to wear them. Eventually, all the judges and even the Supreme Court justices started to recognize the bow tie, and it just became a trademark.
Do you have a legatus bow tie yet?
I do have a legatus bow tie.
Well, I don't think you have this one, so I'm going to give you this one. We have a red one and a silver one.
I do not have this one. I have the other one.
This is a silver one.
That is a great surprise.
Italian design. We thought there were a lot more bow tie wearers than there are, but there's only certain, I feel like, body types that can have the bow tie. And so you're one of those. So, John, thanks for joining us for this podcast, and appreciate you, again, walking the walk and being an ambassador for Christ in the marketplace.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. And thanks for all you do for Legatus.
Thank you.